Dr. Avinash Baskaran and Dr. Yves Nazon, both recent postdocs. Yes, come on up to the stage. So we are fortunate enough to have these two gentlemen working with us at Oshawa. Our grant has them here as part-time, so they are hireable. And in a year, we're hoping to keep them on if we've got funding, but you all know how this world works. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but just know they're looking for work.
Thank you, Alicia. Appreciate it. Let's put it here.
Yeah. Thanks.
Oh, JK.
Oh, they clicked the yeah. That looks right.
Sure.
You want to switch it to extend screen?
We weren't going to do presenter notes.
Okay. What do you think?
This one.
All right. Okay. Yeah. How many engineers does it take to start a presentation?
At least more than two. We have phenomenal tech support right here, so we're working out.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. You know, we're really grateful to have you all. You know, Eve and I are postdocs and we're somewhat new and into our career. So I actually graduated in the spring, so really new. And just really grateful to be able to share with you guys the time and your perspectives. Just hoping to hear from the presenters and hope to present something useful today here in our time. So my name is Avinash. I have my bachelor's in biomedical engineering, master's and PhD in mechanical engineering. So during my PhD for 3 years, I was a NASA fellow, so developing exoskeleton control technologies to improve the health and safety of astronauts. And so following that experience, I joined Oshawa as a part-time postdoctoral fellow. And I've also started a couple of interesting organizations kind of around the ideas of open source. So I started, you know, a little bit of the story is I turned down some more lucrative job offers to move to rural Alabama in an unincorporated part of the country to start the Precision Agronomy Research Center. And the idea behind PARC is there are a lot of cool open healthware technologies that are still struggling from the need to network, to generate test data, independent validation. And so at PARC, I'm working with a couple of funding partners to pilot open source technologies with the applications towards rural resilience and health and medical applications where supply chain is constrained. So I'm working with Open Source Ecology to develop an autonomous version of their open source tractor. I'm working with Public Invention and Open Flexure Microscope to actually model biological samples from farm animals. And so that's something I want to talk to people here about is third-party validation with animal models. I'm definitely interested in working with you guys. And I'm also working with Auburn University in the state of Alabama to help teach and mentor from the K through 12 level all the way to veterinary medicine and clinical students at Auburn University. And so starting to try and get open source into the hands of clinicians and develop the education and the language and the literacy around open source so that as the healthcare community matures, there are trained clinicians and vet med professionals who can embrace that technology. And so on the for-profit side, I guess not really for-profit, but I'm not profiting yet, but human labs. So the idea is there are people who want to use open source who either have a hard time selecting devices or sourcing them or how to manufacture them. So specifically an application with K through 12 teachers, especially in the rural areas where they just don't have necessarily the literacy or supply chain to get these materials and to maintain open source materials. So I'm working with teachers in 5 states. And in Alabama alone, 3 different high schools, over 1,000 kids that are seen every day by the program to basically find open source technologies that are related to EdTech or can be applied to EdTech. For example, Open Flexure Microscope, and to manufacture them, sometimes on a contract manufacturing basis, distribute them, develop curriculum around them, and support and maintain those and to provide assistance there. So this is as close as I'm getting to a business card right now because it's just, I graduated in the spring. So if you would take a picture or just remember my name, and it's at oshwa.org, shoot me an email if you're interested in talking, learning. The main thing I need right now desperately is guidance, advice, and just a wealth of wisdom and how to proceed. So again, grateful for you guys to be here and share your time with us, and I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Dr. Baskaran. So my name is Dr. Yves Nazon II, and so all my degrees are in mechanical engineering. I graduated from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Go Blue. Love to see it. So currently, I am a policy researcher here at OSHWA, but also I am a mechatronics fellow at Walter Reed National Military Center right outside of DC. I work in a lab where we look at soldiers who have amputation and look at how can we better their quality of life? How do we monitor what the quality of life looks like after different and varying forms of amputation? I specialize in making test systems and making devices, which is also a thing that I do separate from this. I'm also an engineer and consultant, so I have colleagues that I work with from NASA, George Mason University, and Johns Hopkins University, where we specialize in mechatronics or electromechanical systems and building and designing those things. So if you're interested in that, please, I'll be around all weekend and love to talk to you about that. But thanks. Now that you've heard about us, let's tell you about what we've been doing. So I'm going to go take you briefly through a roadmap of what we've done and talk about where we're planning to go. So as Alicia's already done so phenomenally, we learned a lot during our times during COVID. And then so during COVID is during those times that we learned actually, okay, maybe there might be something here with this Healthware idea or doing something with open source medical devices. And so from that, we applied to funding. We tried some initial interviews that really informed a series of workshops that we performed. So many of you actually were there, and these were virtual workshops that we performed to get a better understanding of what it is that our community wanted and what it is that our community needed. And so from these virtual workshops, we were able to then really hone in on some key questions and then figure out in some in-person workshops what are specific questions that members of our community really care about. And so it was from that we pulled 4 key themes from all of this data and all of these interviews and workshops that we have been performing. And then after talking about those 4 themes, we'll talk about some of the future directions. So I'll start with COVID. Before COVID, as Alicia pointed out, there were, we now currently have 79 health or medical related devices that are certified on OSHWA. Before COVID, we had 1. So that means 78 before COVID. And that was really because we had little to no concept of what it meant to have a medical certification, right? We certified open hardware devices, and that seemed sufficient at the time. But it was during COVID where we really saw that quick access to medical equipment like PPE, ventilators was incredibly important. Some examples of this were at the University of Wisconsin. They made an open source face mask that was actually adopted by Ford Motor Company and then made in the millions. Another example of this is a medical device manufacturer called Medtronic. They open sourced their designs for ventilators and made that available to all people due to the need that was seen during COVID. And so after COVID, there are 2 things that really came out that we saw as OSHWA that were needed. So the first was that we had notable and numerous requests for a medical certification that really answered, or a type of certification that answered the question, what does it mean to both be open source and a medical and or health device? And then the second thing we saw was that there were a lot of people who were doing phenomenal work, both individuals as well as organizations, but a lot of these things were disparate and not connected. And so people needed a way to direct them to the organizations or projects that they needed. And so from this, we started what I like to call our Healthware journey. So we thought the best way to do this would be to create an ecosystem, right, that can connect all the people and players that are necessary within this open source medical device system. And we figured it would be much easier to direct everybody if they were connected. So to do this, we applied for an NSF POSE grant, which we got. And we also created this term Healthware, which you'll hear very frequently this weekend. And so Healthware was supposed to be a unifying idea to bring together people who considered medical devices separate from healthcare devices, saying that they didn't really have any overlap. An example of what this might look like is that you could have something that's open source, like a pacemaker, but you also could have something that is, the equivalent of an Apple Watch, or maybe like a sensor ring, like an Aura ring. And both of those things, right, have medical or health related applications, but there are very different things that are necessary to make these things happen. And so we wanted to understand this question about what is required to make an open source healthware certification, or what is really necessary to make something like that. And so we started off by doing 100 plus interviews, and we had some pretty interesting things that we found, at least at our first go. So the first is that if we were to go through with the certification, we're going to need to accommodate a wide variety of needs, right? The US is not the only place here, and so understand there are a wide amount of global needs. There are a wide amount of needs for people who have different regulatory considerations. And so that was something that was important. We also found that certification users valued very transparent and equitable healthcare solutions. Keeping that in mind will be important for future success of the certification. We know that people don't want to do harm, but people are scared of getting sued. And so making sure that we can do something that can both inform people about liability, as well as making sure that the intent of what people are trying to do with their open source devices can be conveyed will be important in the future. And last but not least, we also saw that threat modeling will be important for standards organizations such as the ISO, the FDA, or local regulatory boards, to make sure that they are on board and that whatever we create is not competing with, but is actually compatible with the things that these regulatory bodies create. And so these original interviews set us and led us to a virtual workshop, three sets of virtual workshops, and helped inform those. And so we had some key points that we figured out during these. First and foremost, we as OSHWA are always trying to move where our community takes us. The first thing that we heard loud and clear was that the community does indeed want a healthware certification or something like it. There are people that referred to it specifically as a certification. There are people who referred to a set of norms or practices or standards, but it was a common theme that we heard frequently, and that was encouraging to let us know that we were on the right track. We also were started to identify key stakeholders in this ecosystem that we're hoping to create. So some of these stakeholders might be makers of open healthware devices, people who replicate open healthware devices, clinicians, regulatory bodies, and more. We found certain things that we can already have early on as marks of a successful certification, two of which being this certification will need to align well with whatever your local regulatory board is across the world. So that might be Health Canada if you're in Canada, FDA, what have you. And so we also found that to make a certification, we'll know that it's a good certification because the devices that we are certifying will be well documented and replicable. So we also found that there needs to be somebody, right, that oversees this. And so this certifying body should verify transparency, but not guarantee safety. Alicia already said that we don't want to be the FDA. And so that's important for us to make sure that we're saying that this is truly open, but leaving the guarantees of safety to others. We also found that trust is a very important thing in this equation. So people are going to need to trust the devices that they are trying to build. And so how do we do that, right? How do we build this trust? But lastly, from the virtual workshops, we learned that however we define healthware in a formal sense, should make sure that it emphasizes the importance of good documentation as well as safety in some way, even though that we as OSHWA are not saying that we okay safety. And so from that information, we then got to dig deeper in some of the questions that came out of the virtual workshop and turn them into 2 in-person workshops. And so from here, we saw that we need to manage this interesting triumvirate of risk, safety, and trust. And so we needed to figure out, okay, we understand that we want to mitigate risk, right? But we can't guarantee safety. And what is the interplay of these 3 ideas? We also found that people, at least for the initial iteration of what this healthware idea is going to look like, are interested in OSHWA being the governing body, which is cool and a good thing to know as we move forward. But we also want to keep in mind rather that there will be other iterations of a governing body, right? And so making sure that OSHWA can start there, but we make sure that we create something sustainable that may or may not revolve around OSHWA being a governing body. We saw that clarity is key. So many things, people want to know what they're certifying, why they're certifying, what the certification does for them and does not do for them. And so things that are also going to be important, right, is understanding what OSHWA's role is, as well as understanding the limitations of devices that are certified. We also saw that the certification is going to really need to be inclusive to diverse needs. So we really got to hone in a little bit more about what's going to be important for particularly our global participants, or maybe our non-Western participants, what do they look for in open source devices that make them useful for them, and make sure that we include that when we're thinking about a certification. And then lastly, people want community. And we know that here at OSHWA, community is really what drives things. And so our community can be great for anything from implementing projects to making sure that the ecosystem both sustains itself and grows, as well as the people swapping knowledge, being able to swap resources and all of that. And so making sure that whatever our certification does is inclusive of people and builds community and not takes it away will be something that's really important for the future. And so from all these workshops, right, there are 4 key themes that really appeared. And so the first of which is documentation. Now, what makes documentation important is that people refer to documentation, but they actually have been using that as a proxy for other ideas. So one of the ideas is that when people talk about, oh, documentation is very important, what they're really referring to is this idea of something being safe or having trust in a device. And so one thing that we learned is V&V testing, also known as validation and verification testing, is going to be really important to actually have people trust the devices that they plan on using. One thing that was actually even doubled down on that was third-party testing, right? So it's one thing to have the maker of the device potentially provide documentation that says this device is supposed to work in a certain way, but we found actually third-party testing, right, even bolsters that trust and bolsters that feelings of safety even more. We also found that the better documented that a project is, right, the more safe and the more trust that people have in it. We also found that sometimes when people are talking about documentation, what they're really asking for is ways to connect with different communities or communities that they find to be disparate. So one thing that we found is documentation definitely needs to be culturally adept. So an example of this could be if our certification is able to be seen in multiple languages, or if you have a certification that's both applicable here in the US and maybe somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa and also maybe somewhere in Thailand, right? Making sure that the certification that we create is applicable in multiple environments, multiple regions. We also found that one way of building community that was brought up before is that people are looking to OSHWA to direct them to other places that they have to go. There are plenty of people who have the ability to build and create things, but they need to know, well, if I have part A of an open source device, or maybe if I want to make some tweaks, where do I go to either find the base, or where do I go to find people who are knowledgeable in that? And so having good documentation about who even exists in the space, we found to be incredibly important. We also found specifically for projects, when people talked about documentation, what they really meant is transparency. So they mean, if I find a project, you want to have transparency in that. And so with that, we found that better documentation is going to be something that people kind of desire as a new norm. The current documentation that's held for, new norm. Current documentation that's held for current hardware is actually, we want to bolster that with what we have here for hardware or for Healthware. So briefly, I'll go over this term that we're calling globality, which is really just thinking about what are the global implications of the hardware and of the certification process that we create. And so there are cultural barriers to adoption, and it's just going to be important to keep that in mind. There are places that have fraud. There are places that have different cultural norms. One of our participants said, and I'm paraphrasing, the US is the only place where people can actually pay elected officials to do something, and it's called lobbying, not corruption. And I think that really underscores, okay, depending on where you are, it depends on the rules of engagement. And so we know that people want a governance body. We know that people kind of want to be connected at local hubs. And so we want to make sure that these are things that we account for as we move forward. Quickly, I'll talk about just the idea is like, we need better marketing. People think that open source can mean cheap, and we want to make sure that people understand low cost does not mean low quality. And so just better educating people about what is open source healthware, and how it can be useful is something that will be important for inspiring confidence in the future. Lastly, the idea of reproducibility is something that's very key. And so the points that you're seeing up here are points that I've already talked about, but we have found that when we look at these specific questions through the idea of reproducing something as opposed to being a creator, the outcomes that come from that are going to be very different, and that's going to be important. And so with that, I will pass to Avinash.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yves, for introducing us to the conversations we've been having with our workshop participants and our interviewees and people we've been talking to in the community. And that's a big part of our year one effort, is just trying to understand and capture and image the community that we have here and all over the world. And so up here are, so what I did is I went through all of the Post-it notes that we wrote on walls, all of the Word documents, typing in bullets, and there's thousands of data points. So if you thought you didn't, no one read what you wrote, someone read it, and wrote down kind of what you were thinking on an Excel spreadsheet and labeled them with some data labels I'll talk about. So on your left side is some of the challenges that the open source community is reporting around healthware and health and medical. So things like hurdles to getting certified in other countries and getting certified in the US. Things like the legal risks with entering the health and medical space. And so the width of these columns corresponds to the frequency in which those ideas were represented in our data. And on my left side is some of the quote unquote good futures, things that we're hoping to accomplish with our project. So to help it build trust and confidence and visibility for people developing open healthware. And we can kind of run through the gamut and we'll share this presentation with you. But generally, we're trying to help people address those four themes of documentation, globality, marketing, and reproducibility. And so something else I'm doing in parallel with that is, again, trying to analyze some of the workshop data we have in something like a Likert community study. So we talked about those four core themes that were identified in our notes that we took of participant information. And so from those, I was able to identify some sub-themes like clarity and transparency of documentation, validation and trust around reproducibility, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to skip through some things here, but essentially wanting to score the inputs from participants in terms of themes they clearly mentioned, all the way to themes that were absent or contradicted. And so I'll give an example. Like for the documentation topic, I went through and found, the higher scores and the larger width corresponds to higher prioritization or higher scores. And so some of the things we saw is a huge constraint for documentation in the healthcare community is regulatory documentation. Obtaining that is expensive. Producing that is questionable at best. But stakeholders really desire that, in addition to things like validation documents and wanting clarity and transparency around those things. And so with these data, I'm developing these so-called narratives. So the idea that our stakeholders want validation and regulatory documentation to reach the goal of interoperability, but some of the constraints are liability around producing documentation. And so I did this for the four themes of documentation, globality, marketing, and reproducibility. And this is still an ongoing process. So this is just the online and in-person workshops we've had so far, and just viewing them through those themes and sub-themes. But I'm also cross-categorizing them. So, some people going through the workshop day, they might have felt like, hey, I said something in the first room, and in the second room, I said something different, or contradictory, and I'm leaving. I don't even know if we said anything at the end of the day. But in reality, the way that those conversations evolved and the way that people interacted with one another and shared ideas and came to consensus in these local dynamic pockets is really interesting and valuable. And that's what I'm trying to study as I go forward. So just to again mention and kind of build on what Alicia was saying is that we are eager to get certifications from people to try and build this community in a centralized, standardized, open way. And we're grateful to people who are looking to get certified. And, we have those over 3,000 certified devices represented all over the world. So I'll hand it back. Thank you.
So with that, we had a few other key points that we saw, and just really, I think the most important thing that we want to really highlight here is that one, transparency is key, and people are looking for alternatives, right? Alicia started off by saying how generics are a thing that's very useful for us, how it's important that people can get the insulin and things that they need. And so people want alternatives or parallel systems to the current ecosystems that we have in the healthcare units. But people also want to be positively recognized for their work. And so that's a key thing that we want to make sure that we do, but knowing that it's also a double-edged sword. While people want to be positively recognized, they also don't want to be recognized for hurting someone, because people ultimately don't get in the open to do harm, right? But how do we make sure that we keep things safe, have some form of quality control, whether that's with us or not, while also positively recognizing people for their work? And then last but not least, being aware of misnomers, right? Sometimes people will talk about documentation, but they mean something else. Sometimes people are talking about safety, but they want trust. And so keeping these things in mind, some future directions are fairly simple. We want to continue to poll you both here and abroad about gathering data. We want to continue to take this information. So please take the survey, which you will hear us talk about the entire weekend. And then lastly, but not least, we also hope to create some content, create educational materials to make people more aware of the things that are available to them, both from a resource standpoint and more. And with that, we thank you for your time.